I sort of had this dream of being a writer, but I was always sort of too distracted by other things to really take it seriously. But then when I moved to Nova Scotia in 2010, I suddenly found myself unemployed and living in a small isolated village and knowing no one. So I was like, okay, this is my chance. I have literally nothing else to do. So I decided to start taking it seriously and sort of be more disciplined about writing. I was born in Brighton, England, grew up outside of Cambridge in a village called Girton, and my family moved to Ottawa when I was 11 in 1993. So I went to high school in Ottawa and then did university at McGill in Montreal, and then moved to Scotland for a few years and then came back to Toronto and then finally ended up here in Yarmouth. Writing's always been a part of my life. When I was a kid, even before I could actually write myself, I used to dictate stories to my mum, who very patiently wrote them down for me, and I would do illustrations and so on. I think for my 30th birthday, she gave me like a book that collected all these stories from my childhood that I had dictated to her and she had saved, which was very cute. My parents were very supportive of it and just very supportive of artistic pursuits. They're both musicians, so music was always big and encouraging us to read books. Yeah, they really valued creativity. They were always very supportive of writing as whatever I wanted it to be, as a hobby, as a career, as something I was passionate about. And I always enjoyed writing. I took all the writing classes I could in high school and university, which wasn't a ton, and I wasn't very disciplined about it throughout university or even afterwards. Like I'd published a few stories in university creative writing journals, and I'd written a few stories before then. Made several attempts to write a novel that went nowhere because I just wasn't sort of disciplined enough, and I had lots of other things going on. So yeah, when I moved to Nova Scotia, sort of didn't really know what I was going to do. I didn't think I had what it takes to be a fisherman. I wasn't trained in any trade. My skills were essentially useless in a small town. But writing was something I could do from home. I could do it on my own schedule. I could potentially make some money from it if I sold some stories. So when I moved to Nova Scotia, I started actually finishing stories. There's a Canadian fantasy writer called Charles DeLint. He came to HalCon, the Halifax Science Fiction Convention, a couple of years ago, and he did a whole session on finishing stuff. And he pointed out something that had never really occurred to me before, but seems obvious. Everyone has lots of experience starting projects, but almost no one has experience finishing projects. Like, by definition, you can't finish a project that you haven't started. So like, we've all got lots of like beginnings, but actually finishing something is its own art form almost. He's like, it's important to practice just finishing things, just practice that as a discipline, and just to know what that feels like and know that you can get there. So yeah, practicing finishing things is something that I think is really important probably for any creative endeavor, but especially for writing. I decided that I would find what in sci-fi and fantasy world are called pro-paying markets, which is like a term defined by the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association. Throughout their history, they've been very good at ensuring that sci-fi and fantasy writers get paid, which I think is less common in literary fiction, weirdly. Like, a lot of literary magazines don't pay their writers. Like, the exposure is enough. And in fact, some of them charge submission fees, which I think is terrible and predatory. But because of the SFWA, all serious and respected science fiction and fantasy magazines pay. I think now it's 8 cents a word, which is still not, you're not going to make a lot of money writing short stories. But it's something, it's you can make a few $100 from selling a story to a pro magazine. So I decided I would only submit to professional magazines. I was like, if my stories aren't good enough for professional magazines to want them, I'll do something else. So I started finishing stories, I started submitting them, and I think it was at least a year before I got my first sale. It was a hard slog. Like, it was easy to get dispirited because I got lots of rejections. And at this point, I didn't really have much of a community. Like, I didn't really know how other science fiction and fantasy writers experienced submitting. And of course, now I know that everyone gets hundreds of rejections. Like, there's a real kind of culture around celebrating your rejections. Like, I have a friend whose goal is to get 100 rejections a year, but then occasionally you get an acceptance. And I think just like getting my first acceptance. I sold a story to a magazine, a now defunct magazine called Daily Science Fiction, but they paid pro rates, and getting that first acceptance was very validating in a way that, like, it sort of feels like it shouldn't be. It feels like, oh, if you love your art, like, that should be all that matters. This is something you want to express to the world, and that should be enough. But to me, at least, getting paid for that story is very validating. It was like, okay, someone wants to pay me to tell stories. That sort of makes it clearer to me that it's something that's worth doing. Which, like, I mean, I think speaks to my own lack of confidence in myself, maybe. But as I started getting more and more acceptances, I started to feel more and more confident. And now I feel like anything that I finish, I can sell somewhere, which makes the process of writing feel more directed. It feels like there's a point to it in a way that it didn't always. Like, sometimes before I made any sales, I just thought, like, oh, what? Like, am I just writing these silly stories for myself? Like, the process of writing isn't sort of intrinsically satisfying unless I can also get it out there to an audience. I've been published in a few sort of minor magazines that don't exist anymore. Like, there's one called Urban Fantasy Magazine that was published in that I think folded fairly quickly. An Australian magazine called Andromeda Spaceways In-Flight Magazine, which I think is still going strong. There was a Canadian online magazine called AE, the Canadian Science Fiction Review, that published several of my stories. I like them a lot because they often commissioned original artwork to go with them. The biggest markets I've been published in are Asimov's, which is, you know, one of the most prestigious, oldest, one of the few magazines that sort of goes back to the pulp days. And Lightspeed Magazine, which is a well-respected online magazine. I've also been included in some anthologies, including Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy. That was amazing because a lot of my heroes were published in that anthology. Like, in the table of contents, my name is directly after Salman Rushdie's name. A lot of writers I really admire, like Kelly Link is in it, and Sophia Samatar. So yeah, those moments are really special for me. Like, when I see my name in the same anthology as people I've admired since I was a teenager. I've always liked science fiction and fantasy writers who sort of straddle the, like, literary fiction, genre fiction line a little bit, which is not really a line that I think exists. I guess people who are kind of stylists and who, like, obviously care about the way the language sounds. Both my parents, in fact, were science fiction fans. And my mum introduced me to Ursula Le Guin at a young age. I read A Wizard of Earthsea, which is essentially a children's book about a boy who goes to wizard school. I would claim that it's the best book about a boy who goes to wizard school, and also the author isn't transphobic. And Ursula Le Guin is very, you know, definitely writes science fiction and fantasy, but her writing is also just very beautiful and very kind of precise, and she cares a lot about style. You know, I was in high school in the 90s when cyberpunk was big, so I really liked like Neil Stephenson's book Snow Crash. You know, I think he has his own style as well, but also just sort of like escapist fun. And that's one of the things I really like about science fiction and fantasy, is that it's fun, which is kind of it's almost like embarrassing to enjoy fun art. You know what I mean? Like, there's kind of a myth that science fiction and fantasy is not taken seriously by the literary establishment, which I think is not really true, because, like, a lot of the most celebrated literary authors write science fiction and fantasy. Like, Margaret Atwood writes sci-fi. Kazuo Ishiguro, who's won the Booker Prize, I think he won the Nobel Prize recently for literature, who's written, like, his last two novels are about, one of them is about clones being harvested for their organs, and the other one's about, like, an android who becomes friends with a little girl. Like, they're definitely science fiction. Like, all these award-winning literary authors write science fiction and fantasy. Marlon James, who wrote A Brief History of Seven Killings and won the Booker Prize for that. His next book was an epic fantasy set in, like, a mythological Africa. So it's not true that the literary establishment doesn't like science fiction and fantasy. Like, they love it. But I think it is sort of true that they don't like fun books, like something that's just like fun escapism. The literary establishment doesn't like. And that's one of the things that I really do like. And I really like books that sort of manage to do both at once. And, like, Ursula Le Guin manages to do both at once. A Wizard of Earthsea, her children's book, is about a boy learning to be a wizard and fighting dragons. Like, it's sort of escapist fun, but it's also very, like, beautiful, and it's about the human condition and Jungian psychology. And so books that straddle that line are my favorite. And that's what I sort of aim for in my own writing. Using escapist as a, like, term of disparagement, I think, is weird. Because, like, escapism can be really good and sort of nourishing. If you're describing any other art form, like if you describe going to a concert and you say, like, oh, I was I was transported. Like this music was like took me to this whole different world, and it let me forget my life for 2 hours and just like bask in the beauty of this music. Like that would be high praise for a concert. But if you say like, oh, this book let me forget my life and took me to another world, like, oh, that's just escapist rubbish. Like, it's got to be sad and about real life to be taken seriously. I had these short stories, but I didn't have a book. For some reason, a lot of university presses run competitions for unpublished manuscripts. So I submitted to a couple of those and got several rejections. But then I submitted to one called the Blue Light Books Prize, and I was lucky enough to win it. So that came with some prize money and then a publishing contract with Indiana University Press. So yeah, I have a collection of short stories. Published, it's called The World of Dew and Other Stories. It's mostly stories I've previously published in magazine, but I think there are 5 new ones in there that have never been published before. Yeah, and available wherever fine books are sold. You can buy it, at any online bookstore. Or if you're here in Yarmouth, you can get it at Yarmouth Creatives in the mall, or at the museum gift shop also has it. I'm sure my style has evolved over time. I couldn't tell you how it has. I mean, I'd have to go back and reread my own stories and sort of think about that. Because I write mostly short stories, my style sort of changes from story to story quite a lot anyway. Some of my stories are much more plot driven, and some of them are much more sort of moody. Maybe it hasn't changed over time. Maybe it's just never remained quite stable. No, I don't have an aversion to reading my old stuff. In fact, when I do, I kind of like it. I'm like, oh, this is actually good. I enjoy it. This is good. Which is not something that I feel when I'm writing the story. Like a lot of writers, when I'm actually in the middle of writing a story, it's a part of me that's saying, oh, this is garbage. No one wants to read this. But I find when I've finished something, it kind of transforms the story into its own thing, and then it sort of feels complete and solid in a way it didn't before. And then I find I usually like it once I've decided I finished. And certainly once I published it, I'm like, oh, well, if Asimov's liked it, then it must be good. So if someone I don't know is praising it, it must be worthwhile. And coming to a small town is a little bit intimidating. I had some preconceived prejudices about what small towns are going to be like. I thought everyone in a small town is conservative and there are no creative people around. And that's what I thought when I first moved to Yarmouth. I Googled writing groups and I couldn't find any. But it turns out there are tons of creative people in Yarmouth. You just have to sort of dig for them a little bit more. There is a writing group, it just doesn't have a website because no one in the writing group is a web designer. Unlike in Toronto, where everyone's a web designer. Creative people started to come out of the woodwork, and I sort of discovered a community, and just wasn't quite in the places that I would have discovered that community in a city. For example, a lot of the creative people in Yarmouth seemed to be involved with the Arc, and I was never a theatre kid. I had no interest in doing anything on stage, but because that's where the creative, interesting people seem to be in Yarmouth, I did get involved. First playing in pit band for musicals, and then later I was on stage, acting parts and even some singing parts, which I never would have thought I would have attempted. And I ended up really enjoying it, and as I said, meeting this creative community. But yeah, I joined the orchestra and the band and the swing band in the summer. So yeah, I'm still involved in music. I used to play in a little sort of world music band with some friends. So it was never as much of a passion as writing was. I was good at playing the clarinet, but I know what it means to be passionate about classical music, and I don't have that passion. It's not natural for me to sort of seek out community anyway, and writing, of course, is a very solitary pursuit, so anytime I'm spending in community with people, I'm not writing. Yeah, it's kind of a paradox. I crave community and I crave artistic community, but I'm not good at exploiting it, I guess. And in fact, coming to Yarmouth, I found maybe more useful than having a specifically writing community was just being around other creative people, getting involved in the Arc and meeting people from the Art Society and meeting photographers and filmmakers and so on. Yeah, I think it was more creatively nourishing to just meet other people who were doing other creative stuff, not necessarily writing. I think I'll stick to speculative fiction. I think there's just so much you can do with it. It feels sort of even vaster than writing, mainstream fiction or literary fiction. You're not confined to reality. It has the ability to imagine the world being different And it can do that in sort of a wider way than realist fiction can. And I think that ability to imagine how the world could be different, imagine different ways that we could be as people, or different ways that the world could be around us, has the potential to be really revolutionary. Because if we want to change the world for the better, or if we want to make lives that are different from the kind of lives that are preconceived for us, being able to imagine different ways of being seems really important. Some people say that science fiction is the literature of ideas. The truth to that is that it can explore ideas in a way that's not accessible to other art forms. Just being able to imagine how the world might be different seems like a really kind of powerful thing. That's kind of almost the goal of creativity to me, because it can imagine a world that's entirely unlike our own, that doesn't follow any of the same laws as our own, doesn't have any of the sort of same preconceptions as our own. It becomes this sort of font of revolutionary ideas, and I just really like that as something to aspire to as a sci-fi writer. Barb the Bomb and the Yesterday Boy. I have a crush on a boy from yesterday. He's a small, lean boy about my age, a beggar child. I first see him sitting in a boarded-up doorway in Fumbler's Alley. He holds a cloth cap out in front of him, shaking it so that the coins tink-tink together. He has a piece of slate with words scratched onto its face. Spare a thought, spare a coin, thank you from yesterday. It's the tink-tinking that catches my attention, but it also catches the attention of a gang of proud scum kids. I've seen them before. They call themselves the Snyders, and their leader is a big ugly kid named Mulligan. As I watch, they muscle right up to the Yesterday Boy. They dare each other to touch him, and then Mulligan steals the change right out of his hat. The others laugh. The poor Yesterday Boy doesn't even notice, of course, because that happens today, and he's still living yesterday, but he will notice tomorrow. I tear across the street all fists and kicks. At school they call me Barb the Bomb because of my sudden tempers. I like that nickname. I have to dodge a clattering carriage and a group of proper folk to get to Mulligan and his gang, but I'm fast, and I reach the Snyders before my mother even notices I'm no longer by her side. She starts to scream at the same moment that Mulligan does. Before the rest of the gang realise what's happening, I've punched him twice in the nose and kicked him hard in the shins. He drops his stolen coins and yells a lot of nastiness, and then his gang is upon me. They pin me to the cobbles and sit on me, force my face into the filth and sewage that fill the gutter. Then Mulligan stamps on my fingers, and it's my turn to scream. My mother saves me from that one. She beats the Snyders off with the blunt end of her umbrella. They run off swearing revenge, and also just swearing. Then my mother hooks the handle of her umbrella around my neck and pulls me to my feet. I choke and splutter while she looks me up and down and inspects my crushed hand, my drenched and stinking dress, my bruised face. She's clearly furious, but she doesn't say anything. That's much scarier than even the worst scolding would have been. She just watches me with her hands on her hips. She wants to know what I hoped to accomplish with my behaviour. So I bend down and gather up the scattered coins with my uninjured hand and drop them in the Yesterday Boy's hat. He won't notice me until tomorrow, but I smile at him anyway and tell him that my name is Barb. Don't touch him, my mother warns, or you might end up when he is. Her voice is sharp and quivers with anger, but there is also a note of sympathy there. Perhaps a part of her understands why I had to do it. There's nothing more you can do for him, says my mother. But I'm not so sure. I can come back tomorrow and watch the theft and the fight play out on his face. Watch how he reacts when I return his coins. And maybe, if he guesses that I might come back, he'll smile and thank me and tell me his name in return. And that could be the start of an awkward, blushing something.